The dawn of the Nugget.
Nearly 25 years after the original film hatched on the big screen, the sequel to Chicken Run, Dawn of the Nugget, has finally dropped on Netflix, with many of our favorite heroic fowls and nasty villains making a return alongside other newer characters. It's time to see where they all land on the morality scale. Welcome to WickedBinge. This is Chicken Run, Dawn of the Nuggest characters, good to evil. Obviously, spoilers ahead. It's time to start with the so-called golden eggs of this group. These characters are the good. Unsurprisingly, our gold medal of good goes to the hen heroine herself, Ginger. Yes, even after all these years, Ginger still manages to be an incredibly heroic character in spite of all the trauma she's been through at the hands of Mrs. Tweety. However, we should get her minor bad points out of the way first, as Ginger isn't quite as noble here as she was in the first film. Although she still cares about the well-being of others, Ginger ultimately chooses to put the well-being of her friends, and especially her daughter, above the well-being of other chickens. Even after she learns about another chicken farm nearby, Ginger decides to have everyone hide in order to avoid being caught instead of rallying the troops for a rescue mission.
We have to hide.
It's only after Molly is captured that Ginger leaves the island and faces her fears. Speaking of Ginger's new role as a mother, her style of parenting feels pretty reminiscent of characters like Ariel or Simba after they had daughters. Like those characters, Ginger chooses to hide her past instead of explaining her worries to her daughter, thus making her come off more as bossy, overprotective, and not willing to understand when, in reality, all she wants is for Molly to avoid being traumatized like she was. Thankfully, in terms of animated mothers, Ginger is far from being the worst. She cares for Molly greatly, not even hesitating to go after her when Molly gets captured, and she even goes head-to-head with Mrs. Tweety just to protect her. Later on, in the film's climax, Ginger is inspired by her daughter's bravery and chooses to free all of the chickens from this new farm, saving them from being turned into nuggets. Speaking of young Molly, she easily earns our silver medal of good. While she starts off as a bit rebellious, wanting nothing more than freedom, and often shrugging off her mother's concerns for the sake of exploring, this mostly comes from Molly being more sheltered and naive than outright malicious.
Freedom.
Once she's on her own, Molly does indulge in a bit of playtime, admittedly, but once she starts noticing all the things wrong with her new farm and all its collars, Molly takes it upon herself to try and figure out the truth of things.
Maybe we should try and find out what's going on in this place,
so that she can rescue everyone. In many ways, you can say that Molly takes after her mother, and while she's still a kid, we're able to see her mature somewhat throughout the film. We even see her be willing to die at the hands, or axe, of Mrs. Tweety, so long as it means saving the other chickens from falling into the meat grinder. She may start out as a bit selfish, but Molly ultimately cares greatly for others, including her parents, and is well on her way to being a hero in her own right. Rounding out both this family and our podium of good, the bronze medal goes to Rocky. While he may still have a slight lone free ranger side to him, Rocky does try his best to be a good and supportive husband and father to his family, always having their backs. Although he tends to rush into things, leading to him being separated from the group for most of the film, Rocky is shown to be determined when it comes to rescuing the ones he loves. He'll have his family's back in a fight, and is willing to play the role of distraction so that Ginger and Molly are able to get to safety. He's also the one to come up with the popcorn idea that saves all of them from getting grounded up in the corn silo. So, while he may be a bit of a bumbling dad at times, this is still one cool rooster who's able to keep in step with the rest of his freedom fighter family. Next up, we have the island's resident inventor and Ginger's right-hand hen, Mac. Like in the first film, Mac is primarily the one who assists on plans and uses her tools, gadgets, and wits to help Ginger and the others succeed in their goals. We don't see her invent too much in this film, unfortunately, but she still has her clever moments, like being the only one who's able to unlock the farm's happy collars, saving Ginger from being mindlessly happy. Additionally, while the others are celebrating Ginger's decision to hide instead of trying to fight the new farm at the start of the film, Mac is the only one who checks in on Ginger and questions her decision. She may be the brains of the group, but Mac's tendency to also be a really good and supportive friend is even more admirable. From brains to brawn, we're going to rank Bunty next. After so much time in their own little piece of paradise, Bunty has certainly softened up from the incredibly cynical and tough hen she was in the first film. While she may still question certain plans or have her reservations, we don't see her harshly shut these plans down like she would have before, nor is she nearly as violent as she once was. She'll still fight when she needs to, of course, like when she and the other members of the B team take out a random security guard. Outside of this, though, Bunty mostly focuses on being a good team player and on keeping an eye on Babs Babs when she needs to. Her loyalty and character development is on full display. When, after Ginger says she's going to stay behind to rescue the other Happy Farm chickens, Bunty doesn't even hesitate in saying that she's going to stay with her. Finishing up the original group of hens, we have Babs, who is just as ditzy and airheaded as ever in this film. Maybe even more so, if we're being honest. Yeah, Babs might have gotten hit with the Flanderization stick just a little. Still, she's not a bad character by any means. Although it's easy for her to get distracted or not fully realize the danger that she and the others are in, and when she does, it usually results in her briefly fainting. Babs will still follow her friends and be there for them no matter what. She uses her knitting to help capture a security guard, and later on, when the group needs to free Ginger from her happy collar, it's Babs who provides Mac with the tools she needs, thanks to having it in her purse. These are minor wins, admittedly, but they're still wins regardless. We've finally come to another new character, that being the teen chicken, Frizzle. On the surface, it may be easy to think of Frizzle as simply a bad influence to Molly, given that it's Frizzle who encourages Molly to get on the chicken farm truck. We also learn that Frizzle actually came from a decent farm herself, only leaving because she thought it was boring and was seeking fun and adventure instead, not because she was in any danger.
You get to sit in a bucket?
This alone could make her come off as an ungrateful character. Thankfully, while this introduction may not be the best, Frizzle herself is not that bad of a character. Like Molly, she's able to start to see the Happy Farm for the creepy and suspicious place it is, and is willing to help Molly discover the truth. It's nice to see how well these two bond and become good friends, even if Frizzle originally saw Molly more as a kid. In that sense, it's almost a shame that Frizzle essentially gets taken out of the movie halfway through it once a happy collar is put on her. We've finally arrived at everyone's favorite rat duo, Nick and Fetcher. Although they're still technically thieves, much like Bunty, these two have softened up quite a bit from their portrayal in the first film. For starters, instead of just being shallow business partners who are only interested in getting eggs from the chickens, these two have grown to care actually about the chickens as friends. They even get emotional when Molly calls them Uncle.
Uncle Nick! Uncle Fetcher!
Thus making them all the more willing to join in on the mission to rescue her later on. They don't get too many heroic moments to shine on their own, but at the very least they're able to provide Rocky and later the other chickens with some backup, albeit in a comedy relief sort of way. But hey, it's still a nice attempt on their part that shows how far their relationship with the chickens has come. Wrapping up the good, we have the former military rooster, Fowler. If we're being completely honest, Fowler really doesn't get a ton to do in this film, with the others seeing him as too old to do much more than be the getaway man, which he spends most of the film complaining about. And when he's not doing that, he's just rambling to a snail about it. Thankfully, Fowler does get a couple small moments of glory towards the end of the film, and even lands the finishing blow on Mrs. Tweety when she tries to stop their escape truck. So hey, maybe this old rooster's still got some fight in him after all. Before heading into the fiery depths, let's briefly talk about the characters that fall right in between when it comes to morality. Welcome to the gray area. We only have one character who makes it into this spot, and that's Reginald Smith, aka Sir Eats-a-Lot. Or at least, that's what Dr. Fry mistakenly calls him.
The name is Reginald Smith.
Being a simple businessman, Reginald is really only a means to an end when it comes to Mrs. Tweety's hopes of being rich and getting her revenge. He's not a malicious man by any means, he just takes Dr. Fry's happy collars and their effect on the chickens at face value, not really giving too much thought to the chickens or how messed up the whole situation is. This dismissal doesn't necessarily come off as cruel, however, just ignorant, as he likely just sees the chickens as Tweety herself once did, that being as mindless creatures who don't really think or feel like humans do. It's not right per se, but it's also not him being your typical cartoony evil businessman. He also doesn't try to fight back against the chickens once they escape, although to be fair, even if he had, we doubt he'd be able to do much against them anyway. All in all, Reginald seems like a relatively reasonable businessman, but he still falls into the gray area for being willing to overlook what many would see as concerning chicken-raising conditions for the sake of profit and deliciousness. Finally, we've come to the truly bad eggs of the lot. These characters are the bad to evil. For our silver medal of evil, we're giving it to the kooky Dr. Fry. While he may have the title of doctor, perhaps lovesick fool is the best way to describe Fry. Being Mrs. Tweety's second husband, he follows her lead and does anything she asks of him, from keeping the chickens in line to happily sending them off to be slaughtered and cooked. Using his many doctorates, Fry was able to create happy collars that forced chickens into being happy, aka brainless and complacent, in order to prevent any attempts at escape. Of course, doing this is just as bad, if not worse, than what the chickens went through in the original film. What's more, he doesn't seem to feel guilty about doing any of this at all, focused only on pleasing and providing for his new wife, not even trying to argue or fight back against her, even when she's showing her worst sides. In many ways, this almost makes him worse than the original Mr. Tweety. This guy may not come off as cruel thanks to his silly grin and just overall goofy character, but he's most certainly a villain, even if he can't hold a candle to this franchise's main baddie. Finally, our gold medal of evil naturally goes to the one and only Mrs. Tweety. We don't think anyone was expecting this lady to return, but for what it's worth, she certainly makes the most of her second appearance. Going from being an old-school prison warden to a 60s James Bond-esque supervillain, Mrs. Tweety continues to be all about being cruel and making buckets full of cash by any means necessary. Now, instead of only seeing chickens as mindless creatures for her to use for profits, she seems to get a special kick out of trying to slaughter them, especially when it comes to Ginger and her family. From delighting in celebrating chickens to the grinder, to threatening both Ginger and Molly with an axe, the Mrs. Tweety in this film really has just gone full supervillain, wanting nothing more than to finally get revenge on all chickens for humiliating her.
And Militia Tweety will have her revenge.
And this is before she runs back into Ginger and her crew. Unsurprisingly, Tweety is also still a pretty toxic partner, making it crystal clear that she only married Dr. Fry for his resources and his brain, instead of having any actual love for him, and being more than happy to resort back to being verbally and physically abusive towards him like she was with her first husband. Speaking of which, whether it was through divorce or through more unscrupulous means, we're sure that the Tweety's separation wasn't a pretty one. Later, when she meets Reginald, we see her pretty blatantly flirting with him, and in front of Dr. Fry, no less. So, yeah, safe to say that we can add Gold Digger to Mrs. Tweety's long list of negative traits. All in all, given just how much worse she became since the first film in terms of her overall evilness, it's clear that Mrs. Tweety is still a true villainess, as well as a true threat to chickens everywhere.